Welcome to this episode of the 929 English podcast. We're both honored and privileged to welcome back Rachel Sharansky Danziger. Welcome back, Rachel. It's so nice to have you back.
Thank you, Rabbi Adam. It's really my privilege to be here.
These weeks, we find ourselves reading the fourth book of the Torah. The fourth book of the Torah, as we know, is called Bamidbar. Now, the name Bamidbar, meaning desert, is actually chosen just by chance. It's the first significant word in the first verse of the first chapter of the book. But Bamidbar, in the desert, the Jews wandered for 40 years in the desert. And this is the book that seems to highlight that trip, those wanderings. Rachel, what do you make of the fact that the Jews wandered in the desert for 40 years? What's the significance of those wanderings?
It's interesting. In order to answer your question, I think I need to take a step back and point out that the nature of their wandering changes about a third into the book. When we start the book, we and the people in the book, the Israelites themselves, think that we're talking about a short and pretty purposeful journey. We started the arc of the Exodus with coming out of Egypt. We received the Torah. We had a little bit of a delay over the golden calf, but let's leave that behind now. And now we're supposed to complete the arc and go into the Promised Land. And until Parashat Shalach, until the parasha, the Torah portion that deals with the sin of the spies, that's what the Israelites, that's what Moshe, that's what God planned. And then suddenly God turns the table on them and says, no, you, the people who went out of Egypt, are not going to make it into Israel. In fact, you're going to spend the rest of your life journeying around and around through the desert, wandering through this journey for journey's sake, really, until you die out. And then your descendants will be free to complete that short and purposeful journey that was canceled and go into the Promised Land. And in a sense, by giving us both halves of this story, both the optimistic beginning and then the long, meandering, painful, and tragic rest of the story, I think that Chumash Bamidbar, the book of Bamidbar, draws our attention to the fact that even when people wander purposelessly, or at least seemingly purposelessly, certain things can happen. That even when people deviate from what's supposed to be plan A, it doesn't mean that their life is over. It means that other things are now about to happen. And interestingly, those latter portions in Torah portions in Bamidbar, they don't describe people walking like zombies through the desert. They describe people who are grappling with understanding what their place is in the covenant, and in many ways affecting positive changes in it, or owning it, or finding their voice within it. Some of their attempts are less fortunate, and the story of Korach and his challenge to Moshe and Aaron comes to mind. Some of those attempts leave a lasting and positive marks. Think about the daughters of Tzlefchad that later in the book come with a complaint to God that leads God and Moshe to change the codex of the law. Think about the tribes of Gad and Reuven, who later come to Moshe and say, we want to settle in Transjordan, not in the Promised Land. And while God and Moshe both respond to it with some mixed feelings, we know that it had an enormous impact on the history of the Israelite kingdom moving forward. It really shaped the economy, the society, the life in many ways. Could those developments happen if not for those years of wandering in the desert? Could those developments come to be if all we would have had is that short and purposeful trip? I don't think so. And in that sense, I think that it's a book about how sometimes journeys that don't have a clear ending actually open the door to many experiences of change and growth.
So, Rachel, you bring up a fascinating topic, the topic of wandering or of wanderers, and how we grow through our wanderings. And what we'd like to do over the next 3 short conversations is to explore three wanderers. Today, we'll look at Avraham. In the next conversation, we'll look at Yaakov. And in the third conversation, we'll look at David. But specifically, look at them as wanderers. And hopefully, by studying three very different wanderers, we'll come back at the end of the three conversations and have a better appreciation about the value of wandering and the significance of wandering in our book, the Book of Bamidbar. So, Rachel, let's start with our forefather, Avraham. Lech lecha me'artzecha. Avraham is introduced with God instructing him to leave his father's land and basically to wander, to go el haaretz asher areka, to the land that I will show you. And we don't know very much about that land that God will show Avraham. Why do you think that Avraham specifically is introduced to us as a wanderer?
I think it has to do with the role that Avraham is to play. Let's think for a second about the world he lived in. Avraham lived in a world where people worshipped idols, people worshipped embodied gods, people believed that kings or people in authorities are certain iterations of divine entities. People were comfortable with all kinds of rituals that surrounded those in powers. And here comes this man, and he's somehow supposed to encourage people to follow a radically different form of spirituality, worship an invisible and in many ways incomprehensible God, follow a moral code that isn't tied to those in authority and doesn't bow to them. In fact, follow him, Avraham, in rebelling against those authoritarian regimes, if that's the right thing to do. How can anyone do that? How can anyone revolutionize religion, faith, spirituality, ethics to such a degree when he's enmeshed in the culture he's trying to change, or at any rate leave and create something different as an alternative to it? And in a sense, perhaps by telling Avraham, set out, and not only set out, but set out into the unknown. Start walking, not knowing where you're going. Take this unknown with you. Ride with it, eat with it, drink with it, sleep with it. Perhaps God is trying to help Avraham be ready to create this radically new, different of spirituality. I mean, think about it for us. When we travel in our life and in our day and age, we travel with GPSs. We travel with Google Maps. We travel with Waze. When I immigrated, even though for a temporary leave, but still, when I immigrated from Jerusalem to Boston, I had pictures of the place I will live. I had pictures of the insides of the place I will live. I could tell you exactly what street it's on. I could describe to you the neighborhood. I knew everything about it. And yet, despite all those things that we know, anyone who ever immigrated or spent an extended time in a different culture can tell you the same thing, that when you leave your motherland behind, the land of your mother and father behind, the place where you grew up behind, you're not just leaving behind a place, you're leaving behind a whole set of certainties. And as you start immersing yourself into a new place, you start noticing that certain things that you just thought were the way things are in the world, universal human nature, the way society is always run and will always run, were actually local, social, conditional, and most importantly, perhaps, changeable. You suddenly acquire this critical point of view that allows you to realize that things can change. And Avraham is called upon not merely to realize that, but to constantly keep challenging himself to remember that by staying on the go. Even when he reaches the Promised Land, he almost immediately has to leave to Egypt due to a famine. Later, when he comes back into the Promised Land, God tells him, keep traveling, keep walking around. He is constantly challenged to leave any certainty he might have felt in any place he might have started settling down in behind, to constantly open this internal place, this psychological space that allows him to be Avraham Ivri, famously, the man who can be on one evel of a river, on one side of a river, even though the rest of the world is on the other side. Wandering allows him to do that.
So there are so many fascinating points. I'll just focus on the last point. Avraham Ha'ivri, to be on the other side. When you're a wanderer, you're always on the other side because you're not set, you're not established in any one place. So by definition, when you wander, you're the outsider. And that's fascinating. Well, first of all, it's fascinating to look at Avraham as the first immigrant, because that's the idea. Lech lecha me'artzecha. I need you to be an immigrant. But you described your move from Jerusalem to Boston. You know, you were open-minded and you saw a new world in Boston. But if after a month we would have told you to go, you and your husband and your children, to move to Portland and then to San Francisco and then to Dallas and then to Chicago and then to Minneapolis and then, you know, every month to choose a different city, my hunch is probably that there would have come a point where you would have said, enough is enough. But Avraham, it seems like every single chapter we have him as a wanderer. Even the major story of the Akedah, the binding of Yitzchak, God tells him, I want you to travel, again, to an unknown place. Just by definition, an unknown place, an unknown situation. Wow. I mean, and that was the most charged moment. But again, it was the idea of being a wanderer. So I think the point of the fact that Avraham is described as being on the other side, you need to be on the other side. But it's fascinating that in the promise to Avraham that God gives to him at the end of Parshat Lech Lecha, God says to Avraham, that your descendants will be enslaved, but eventually they're going to come to be settled in the land. You know, you might have thought, Avraham Ha'ivri, that his children, God's promised him, will be just like you, Avraham, moved every month. So too your children will move every month, and that's the plight of the Jewish people. They will always move every single month. But no, it's not so. The promise to Avraham is that your children will be settled. Rachel, how do you understand that? What is the relationship between the fact that Avraham needs to be Avraham Ha'ivri, the wanderer, and the fact that the promise to him is that his descendants will be settled?
I just want to add to your question before I answer it. I mean, you know, it's the Jewish way, right? Add to the question first. So it's not really that he's told, your children will be settled in the land. He's even said, keep wandering, and every step you take, every place you step in, your children will inherit this land. But he's also told, keep walking, and every step, every place where you step, your children will be settled. In a sense, through his own unsettlement, through the fact that he's constantly in motion, he is buying the settlement that his children will receive. God himself, in the way he words it, ties between Avraham's eternal wandering and the people's eventual settlement in the land. And I think that this has to do with the great danger that the Israelites will face, those very Israelites that are currently in Chumash Bamidbar, wandering around in the desert, waiting for a new generation to settle the land, to cross the Jordan and settle the land. Once they do, they will face a new danger. They'll think that they left the problems behind Bamidbar, in the desert, but really, they will face the danger of becoming complacent. They will face the danger of building a society, building their own status quo, and becoming enslaved to it, becoming so accustomed to comfort that they wouldn't want to do anything to challenge it, that they wouldn't want to face uncomfortable truth. They wouldn't want to be critical of their own society. They wouldn't want to make sure that their society matches the ideals, the goals, the values that brought them to the promised land in the first place, because it's more comfortable not to. We all know that. So this danger requires from them a certain eternal alertness, a certain eternal dedication to questioning. And what a better way to instill that in them and to inoculate them against the warping effects of the status quo than to tell them that their own settlement in the land is bought through Avraham's unsettlement, thus constantly challenging them to remember that wanderer that bought them their current peace, their current comfort, and the way that he couldn't settle down and couldn't just accept reality around him and couldn't stop being an iconoclast. And remember that their settlement in the land depends on living up to the same level of internal freedom from complacence, even though they are settled down. And I think that that's really the secret of this connection.
Wow. I think on that note, which is an extremely important and insightful note about Avraham, about the Jews in the desert, and about the settled Jews in the land, let's pause and let's take it up next time with Yaakov Avinu, who also was a wanderer, but creates new challenges to understand the significance of wandering and the importance of wandering for us today. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, everyone, for being part of the 929 English family.